network, his interlocking fields of fire, his strategy of defense in depth, all of it was engineered to make capturing the island so costly that American planners might reconsider their march toward Japan. He'd succeeded brilliantly in the tactical sense. American casualties were mounting at rates unseen in previous Pacific campaigns, but he'd fundamentally misunderstood the American strategic objective. The United States didn't need to kill every Japanese defender. They didn't need to clear every tunnel or destroy every fortified position. They needed the airfields. Once Marines secured enough of the island to protect those airfields from Japanese artillery, once Seabees could repair and operate the runways, the strategic objective was essentially achieved. Everything else was simply finishing work. This represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that the Japanese military doctrine couldn't quite comprehend. Traditional military thinking held that you defeated an enemy force by destroying it, by overwhelming its defenses, by achieving total victory. But American industrial and logistical superiority allowed for a different calculus. The United States could afford to accept higher casualties in exchange for faster strategic gains. They could bypass and contain enemy strongpoints rather than reducing them through direct assault. They could achieve their objectives even while the fortress remained partially intact. According to strategic analyses conducted by military historians at the United States Naval War College after the war, the decision to proceed with the Iwo Jima invasion, despite understanding the defensive challenges, represented a clear-eyed assessment of acceptable costs versus strategic benefits. Every B-29 that landed safely on Iwo Jima represented 11 crew members saved. Every fighter escort mission that launched from the island increased bombing accuracy and reduced losses over Japan. The airfields were worth the price in American blood, however terrible that price proved to be. The Japanese strategy, by contrast, was ultimately self-defeating. By building an invincible fortress and committing every defender to fight to the death, Kurebayashi guaranteed that his forces would be fixed in place, unable to maneuver, unable to threaten American operations elsewhere. The fortress became a tomb of his own design. The tunnel network that protected his soldiers also trapped them. The strategy of defense in depth meant that once bypassed, positions couldn't be reinforced or resupplied. The Americans could simply contain and reduce these positions at their leisure while continuing to operate the airfields. By early March, this strategic dynamic had become obvious. The first operational B-29 missions were using Iwo Jima as an emergency landing field. P-51 Mustang fighters were being stationed on the island to provide escort for bombing missions over Japan. The Seabees had repaired and expanded the runways, built fuel storage facilities, and established the infrastructure necessary for sustained air operations. Japanese defenders still controlled portions of the northern island and continued fighting from their fortified positions, but they could no longer threaten these operations. The Marines continued their grinding advance northward, clearing defensive positions with flamethrowers and demolitions, sealing caves and bunkers, reducing the fortress piece by piece. But the urgency had diminished. The island was already serving its strategic purpose. The fortress that was supposed to be invincible was being rendered irrelevant even as it continued to resist. Kurebayashi understood what was happening. In messages sent to Imperial headquarters before communications were cut, he reported that American engineers were operating the airfields while his forces still held defensive positions. He described watching B-29s land and take off while he remained unable to strike at them effectively. The fortress had become a spectator to its own strategic obsolescence. This wasn't the first time in military history that seemingly invincible defenses had been circumvented rather than conquered. But it represented a new sophistication in American operational thinking, a willingness to accept that total tactical victory wasn't necessary if strategic objectives could be achieved through other means. The Marines would continue fighting and dying to eliminate the Japanese garrison. But this was as much about ensuring future security and establishing precedent as about immediate military necessity. The fortress was invincible. The Americans just ignored it, and in doing so, they won. March 9, 1945. After 18 days of combat, the 5th Marine Division reached the northern coastline of Iwo Jima, officially cutting the island in half and isolating Japanese defenders into pockets. The fortress hadn't fallen, it had been dissected. What remained were islands within an island, fortified zones still connected by tunnels, still defended by soldiers who had no intention of surrendering, but no longer capable of coordinated defense or strategic impact. The cost of this achievement was staggering beyond anything American military planners had anticipated. By the time organized Japanese resistance collapsed on March 26, the United States Marine Corps had suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, 6,821 killed in action, and nearly 20,000 wounded. These numbers represented roughly one-third of the entire Marine force committed to the battle. Some individual units suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%. Every battalion commander who landed on February 19th was either killed or wounded. The casualty figures revealed the unique horror of fighting against Kuribayashi's fortress. In previous Pacific campaigns, Japanese defensive tactics, the emphasis on beach defenses and banzai charges, resulted in high initial casualties, followed by steady reduction of enemy forces. Iwo Jima inverted this pattern. Casualties remained consistently high throughout the campaign because every defensive position required direct assault. There were no shortcuts, no clever flanking maneuvers, no way to avoid the grinding work of clearing fortified positions one by one. Medical personnel performed miracles under impossible conditions. Corpsmen crawled through fire to reach wounded Marines. Battalion aid stations operated within artillery range of Japanese positions. Hospital ships offshore handled a constant flow of casualties that strained their capacity. The nature of wounds reflected the close-quarters fighting blast injuries from grenades and mortar, burns from flamethrowers, gunshot wounds from firefights measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Japanese casualties were even more catastrophic. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders Kuribayashi commanded, only 216 were captured alive, most of them too badly wounded to commit suicide. The rest died in the tunnels and caves, buried under collapsed positions, sealed in by demolition charges, consumed by flamethrowers, or killed in the final desperate counterattacks that marked the end of organized resistance. The fortress that was supposed to protect them became their mass grave. Kuribayashi himself disappeared during the final days of the battle. Multiple accounts suggest he led a final attack somewhere in the northern part of the island, but his body was never definitively identified. The commander who had promised to fight to the last man and defend Iwo Jima to the death apparently kept his word. The fortress claimed its architect along with everyone else. But numbers alone don't capture the human cost. Every casualty represented a family receiving a telegram, a community mourning a loss, a life cut short or permanently altered. The wounded Marines who survived faced years of recovery, many carrying shrapnel fragments that couldn't be removed, suffering from burns that required multiple surgeries, bearing psychological scars that 1940s medicine barely understood and couldn't effectively treat. The American public, reading newspaper accounts of the battle while watching the famous flag-raising photograph become iconic, struggled to reconcile the image of victory with the staggering casualty lists. Political pressure mounted as the full cost of taking Iwo Jima became clear. Military leaders found themselves defending the decision to assault the island, arguing that strategic benefits justified the losses. The debate would continue for decades. Was Iwo Jima worth the price? From a purely strategic standpoint, the answer was yes. By war's end, more than 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, representing approximately 27,000 aircrew members saved. Fighter escorts flying from the island significantly improved bombing accuracy and reduced bomber losses over Japan. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders seeing American bombers operating from an island that was supposed to be an invincible fortress was immeasurable. The capture of Iwo Jima shortened the Pacific War by demonstrating that no Japanese defensive position was secure. But strategic calculus feels obscene when measured against individual tragedy. Each of those 6,821 killed Marines had a name, a story, a life that mattered beyond operational analyses and casualty statistics. The fortress extracted its price not just in lives lost but in futures erased, the children never born, The achievements never accomplished, the ordinary human experiences never lived. For the Japanese defenders, the cost was total annihilation. Kuribayashi's strategy of fighting to the death meant that his fortress became a sealed vault, a place where 20,000 men went to die with virtually no possibility of survival. Unlike other campaigns where soldiers could retreat or surrender, the defenders of Iwo Jima were committed to remain until death claimed them. The fortress wasn't just invincible from the outside, it was inescapable from within. April 17, 1945. Less than a month after the flag-raising ceremony officially declaring Iwo Jima secure, military analysts from all branches of the United States Armed Forces descended on the island to study what had happened. They walked through the tunnel networks, examined the fortified positions, interviewed survivors, and compiled detailed reports on Japanese defensive tactics and American assault techniques. The fortress, even in defeat, had lessons to teach. The most profound lesson was that defensive engineering had evolved faster than assault tactics. Traditional amphibious doctrine bombardment, landing, advance assumed that firepower could neutralize prepared defenses. Iwo Jima demonstrated this assumption was dangerously outdated. No amount of naval gunfire or aerial bombardment could destroy an enemy that lived underground. Future operations would require new approaches, specialized weapons for bunker warfare, better intelligence gathering to identify tunnel networks, tactics that emphasized containment and isolation rather than direct frontal assault. The Marine Corps studied Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy and recognized its sophistication. His abandonment of beach defenses, his emphasis on letting attackers establish a beachhead before engaging, his use of reverse slope defenses and interconnected positions, all of it represented advanced military thinking that contradicted traditional Japanese tactical doctrine. Staff officers noted that Kuribayashi had essentially invented modern defensive warfare, fortifications designed not to hold territory but to inflict maximum casualties, defense in depth with no expectation of reinforcement or relief, complete commitment to a war of attrition. These lessons informed planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands scheduled for November 1945. Military planners anticipated that Japanese defenders would employ the Iwo Jima model on a massive scale, tunnel networks in the mountains, fortified positions covering every beach and approaches, a garrison willing to fight to total annihilation. Casualty estimates for downfall reflected this assumption, projecting hundreds of thousands of American deaths and millions of Japanese casualties. The fortress of Iwo Jima, multiplied across Kyushu and Honshu, promised carnage beyond comprehension. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 made Operation Downfall unnecessary. Japan surrendered without invasion, and American forces occupied the home islands peacefully. Historians still debate whether the decision to use atomic weapons was justified, but the specter of Iwo Jima inevitably shadows those debates. Would American political will have sustained an invasion promising Iwo Jima-level casualties week after week, month after month? Could democratic nations prosecute wars of that scale and brutality indefinitely? For the Marines who survived Iwo Jima, the lessons were more personal and immediate. They'd learned that courage alone wasn't sufficient against prepared defenses, that technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy willing to die in place. That victory could be achieved even at costs that seemed unbearable. Many struggled with survivors' guilt, the question of why they lived when so many didn't, whether anything could justify the losses they'd witnessed. These psychological wounds proved as enduring as physical injuries. The fortress also taught lessons about the limits of military doctrine and the danger of preparing for the last war rather than the next one. Japanese strategic thinking emphasized honor, sacrifice, and defense of every inch of territory. This doctrine led directly to the Iwo Jima strategy: build an invincible fortress and force the enemy to pay an unacceptable price for worthless volcanic rock. But American strategic flexibility, the willingness to accept high costs for valuable strategic gains, the ability to bypass and ignore the invincible fortress while achieving operational objectives rendered that doctrine obsolete. In the decades following World War II, military theorists studied Iwo Jima as a case study in both defensive excellence and strategic failure. Kuribayashi had built the perfect fortress and implemented a flawless defensive battle. Every tactical decision he made was correct. His forces performed exactly as planned, inflicting maximum casualties while utilizing terrain and fortifications with masterful skill. And yet he lost, because tactical perfection couldn't overcome strategic irrelevance. The Americans achieved their objectives, secure the airfields, project air power toward Japan even, while the fortress remained partially intact. Modern military doctrine reflects these lessons. Special operations forces trained for tunnel warfare. Bunker-busting weapons were developed specifically to address fortified positions. Military planners emphasized maneuver and strategic objectives over direct confrontation with prepared defenses. The fortress of Iwo Jima stands as a monument to the danger of assuming that strong defenses alone can achieve strategic goals. For the Japanese military and nation, Iwo Jima represented something even more devastating. Proof that Bushido valor and willingness to die couldn't overcome material and technological disadvantages. The fortress that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese martial superiority instead revealed the futility of sacrificial defense. Every Japanese soldier who died in those tunnels, all 20,000 of them, died without changing the war's outcome. The fortress guaranteed their deaths without guaranteeing strategic impact. The lessons written in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima remain relevant 8 decades later. They speak to the relationship between tactics and strategy, the limits of defensive warfare, the importance of strategic flexibility, and the terrible human cost of conflict. Today, November 28, 2025, 80 years after the battle's conclusion, Iwo Jima remains an active Japanese military facility, closed to general tourism but open to veteran pilgrimages and official commemorations. The tunnels remain largely intact beneath the volcanic rock, a tomb containing the remains of thousands of Japanese soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. The island stands as both memorial and warning, a reminder of what humans can achieve through engineering and courage, and what they destroy through war. The fortress of Iwo Jima changed military thinking in ways that extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, Chinese forces employed similar tunnel tactics in the hills north of the 38th parallel, creating defensive positions that proved nearly impossible to assault directly. American forces, remembering Iwo Jima, adapted their tactics accordingly, bypassing strongpoints when possible, using massive firepower when direct assault was necessary, accepting stalemate rather than pursuing Pyrrhic victories. Vietnam presented another iteration of the fortress concept. The Viet Cong Sieu Chi tunnels and the elaborate defensive networks throughout South Vietnam echoed Kuribayashi's philosophy: let enemies establish presence on the surface while the real war is fought from underground. American forces struggled with these tactics just as they had struggled on Iwo Jima, learning once again that technological superiority provides limited advantages against determined defenders fighting from prepared positions with nothing to lose. Modern military conflicts continue wrestling with the fortress problem. The tunnel networks beneath Gaza represent a 21st-century evolution of Kuribayashi's concept's defensive infrastructure built over decades, interconnected positions that allow fighters to appear and disappear, strategic depth that renders bombardment ineffective. The technological sophistication has increased ventilation systems, electrical power, communication networks, but the fundamental concept remains: go underground, connect everything, make the fortress invisible and ubiquitous. The human legacy of Iwo Jima proves even more enduring than the military lessons. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single engagement in American military history. 22 of these were awarded posthumously, reflecting the extraordinary sacrifices required to overcome the fortress's defenses. The names of the recipients, John Basilone, Douglas Jacobson, Jack Lummis, and so many others, remain honored in Marine Corps lore. The famous flag-raising photograph by Joe Rosenthal became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The bronze statue of 6 men raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi stands as perhaps America's most recognized military monument. Millions of visitors annually see the image without necessarily understanding the context that 3 of the 6 men in the photograph were killed before the battle ended, that the flag raising occurred only 4 days into a 36-day campaign, that the mountain beneath their feet was honeycombed with tunnels containing defenders who would fight for weeks after that banner was raised. For Japan, Iwo Jima became a symbol of sacrifice and tragedy rather than military virtue. Post-war Japanese society struggled to reconcile the courage of the defenders with the futility of their mission. Kurobayashi himself became a tragic figure, a general who understood his enemy, who fought brilliantly, who demanded maximum effort from his soldiers, yet who led them all to pointless deaths in service of a war that was already lost. His letters to his family, discovered after the war, revealed a man who understood the likely outcome but fulfilled his duty anyway. 22nd of December, 1942, the acrid smell of gun oil and cordite hung in the cold air of the Imperial Japanese Army's Technical Research Institute in Tokyo as Colonel Nambu. Kijiro watched his team of engineers carefully disassemble the captured American rifle laid before them on the examination table. The weapon, an M1 Garand, had been recovered from a battlefield on Guadalcanal 3 weeks earlier, still clutched in the hands of a fallen Marine. What these engineers were about to discover would send shockwaves through the highest levels of Japanese military command and reveal a technological gap that would haunt the imperial forces for the remainder of the Pacific War. The colonel adjusted his spectacles, leaning closer as Lieutenant Yoshida Takeshi, the Institute's lead firearms specialist, began his initial assessment. Yoshida had spent 15 years studying small arms design, including a stint in Germany before the war where he'd examined European weapons development. Yet nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he was now holding. The weight distribution felt different, more balanced than the bolt-action Type 38 Arisaka rifle that Japanese infantry carried into battle. As he worked the action, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Colonel," Yoshida said quietly, his voice barely masking his concern, "this weapon cycles automatically. Each pull of the trigger fires 1 round, and the rifle chambers the next without manual operation." In the corner of the laboratory, Captain Tanaka Hiroshi meticulously documented every measurement, every specification, every mechanical detail in his logbook. Tanaka had been skeptical of American industrial capabilities, repeatedly assured by propaganda that Japanese craftsmanship remained superior in every regard. The precision machining he now witnessed told a different story entirely. According to documentation later referenced in historian John McManus's Grunts, inside the American infantry combat experience, World War II through Iraq, Japanese military analysts had consistently underestimated American weapons technology, a miscalculation that would prove costly on every island battlefield across the Pacific. The examination continued throughout the afternoon as the team methodically tested every component. Major Watanabe Kenji, who specialized in metallurgy, subjected metal samples to stress tests, measuring tensile strength and durability under extreme conditions. His findings troubled him deeply. The American steel demonstrated superior quality, able to withstand heat and pressure that would compromise Japanese manufactured components. The en-bloc clip system, which allowed for rapid 8-round loading, represented an innovation that Japanese designers had never seriously pursued. As darkness fell over Tokyo, Colonel Nambu compiled the day's findings into a preliminary report. The numbers painted an undeniable picture of tactical disadvantage. Where a skilled Japanese rifleman using the bolt-action Arisaka could fire perhaps 15 to 20 aim shots per minute, requiring manual manipulation of the bolt after each round, an American soldier with the semi-automatic M1 Garand could maintain a sustained rate of 40 to 50 rounds per minute with minimal effort. The implications for infantry combat were staggering. In any engagement, American forces could theoretically deliver 2 to 3 times the volume of rifle fire. But the technological superiority extended beyond mere rate of fire. The Garand's effective range, accuracy, and stopping power all matched or exceeded the Arisaka's capabilities while adding the crucial advantage of semi-automatic operation. Nambu recognized immediately that this intelligence needed to reach the highest command levels. though he suspected that such unwelcome news might be dismissed or downplayed by officers who had invested their reputations in assertions of Japanese military superiority. 7th of January, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Arisaka Nariokira, whose uncle had designed the Type 38 rifle decades earlier, sat in uncomfortable silence as he reviewed Colonel Nambu's complete analysis in his office at the Army Ministry. The morning sun streamed through the windows overlooking the palace grounds, but Arisaka felt only coldness as he confronted the reality that his family's legacy weapon had been rendered obsolete by American innovation. The rifle that bore his family name, adopted in 1907 and still serving as the standard infantry arm 36 years later, now appeared woefully inadequate for modern warfare. The Type 38 Arisaka had been designed during a different era, when Japanese military planners prioritized certain characteristics over others. Its 6.5mm cartridge produced less recoil than larger rounds, making it easier for smaller-statured soldiers to control an important consideration, given that the average Japanese infantryman stood approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed around 120 pounds. The rifle's length, nearly 50 inches, incorporated a long barrel that maximized accuracy and muzzle velocity while requiring less propellant, conserving resources in a nation that needed to import most raw materials. According to research documented in historian Max Hastings's Retribution, The Battle for Japan, 1944 to 1945, Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spiritual strength and fighting spirit, what they called seishin, as force multipliers that could overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy, deeply rooted in samurai tradition and Bushido code, led commanders to believe that superior morale and tactical aggression could compensate for inferior weapons. The M1 Garand's performance on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and dozens of other battlefields was systematically dismantling this assumption. Arisaka reviewed reports from various combat zones, each telling similar stories. At close range in jungle terrain, where visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards, the semi-automatic rifle provided devastating advantages. American infantrymen could maintain continuous fire during charges, suppressing Japanese positions while advancing. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, had to work their bolt actions after each shot, creating crucial seconds of vulnerability. In defensive situations, a single American rifleman could hold off multiple attackers through sheer volume of fire, something impossible with bolt-action weapons. The industrial context made Japan's predicament even more dire. John Toland's The Rising Sun, The Decline and Fall of the Japanese Empire, 1936 to 1945, provides insight into Japan's manufacturing limitations during this period. Even if Japanese engineers could design a semi-automatic rifle comparable to the Garand and several experimental models existed, the nation's overstretched industrial base couldn't produce such weapons in meaningful quantities. Every factory, every skilled worker, every ton of steel was already committed to building ships, aircraft, artillery, and tanks. Retooling for a completely new rifle system while fighting a multi-front war was effectively impossible. 16th of February, 1943, across the Pacific Ocean in Springfield, Massachusetts, Foreman Robert Henderson watched the overnight shift at Springfield Armory assemble another batch of M1 Garand rifles destined for troops fighting in North Africa and the Pacific. The facility hummed with industrial energy, its assembly lines representing American manufacturing might at full wartime mobilization. Henderson had worked at the armory since 1928, witnessing the long development process that had transformed John Garand's initial concept into the weapon now pouring off production lines at a rate of 4,000 rifles per day. The rifle's journey from concept to standard issue had been neither quick nor simple. Canadian-born John Cantius Garand had joined Springfield Armory in 1919, tasked with developing a semi-automatic rifle to replace the bolt-action then 1903 Springfield. His early prototypes faced skepticism from conservative military officers who doubted that semi-automatic mechanisms could prove reliable under combat conditions. The Army conducted exhaustive testing throughout the 1920s and 1930s, comparing Garand's designs against competing submissions from other inventors. what ultimately convinced military leadership, according to documents referenced in Bruce Canfield's A Collector's Guide to the M1 Garand, and the M1 carbine, was the Garand's combination of reliability, accuracy, and manufacturability. The rifle utilized a gas-operated mechanism where expanding gases from each fired cartridge drove a piston that automatically ejected the spent casing and chambered a fresh round. This system, simpler than competing designs, proved robust enough to function in mud, sand, rain, and extreme temperatures. The Army formally adopted the M1 in 1936, beginning a production ramp-up that would eventually deliver over 5 million rifles before war's end. Henderson understood that the rifle's real genius lay not just in its design, but in how that design accommodated mass production. Every component had been engineered for efficient manufacturing using the standardized machinery and processes available in American factories. The receiver was machined from forged steel using automated milling operations. The wooden stock could be shaped and fitted by semi-skilled workers following precise specifications. Parts were interchangeable between rifles, allowing field maintenance without custom fitting. This production-friendly design meant that Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company could collectively produce enough rifles to arm the rapidly expanding American military while maintaining consistent quality. The economic context made this possible. While Japan struggled with resource shortages and competed for limited industrial capacity, America's manufacturing sector had been dramatically underutilized during the Great Depression. War mobilization transformed idle factories into weapons production facilities practically overnight. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, automotive plants in Detroit, and specialized machine shops across the industrial heartland all contributed to the war effort. The United States could simultaneously produce ships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and small arms in quantities that simply overwhelmed Axis production capabilities. Technical Sergeant William Bradford, an ordnance specialist stationed at the armory, explained the rifle's combat advantages to a group of visiting journalists that February morning. "The M1 gives our boys 8 shots as fast as they can pull the trigger," Bradford said, working the action to demonstrate. "No fumbling with a bolt between shots. No taking their eyes off the target. No breaking their firing position. In combat, those seconds matter. They're the difference between living and dying." Bradford had reviewed after-action reports from North Africa, where American forces first encountered German troops in significant numbers. While German soldiers carried the excellent Mauser K98 bolt-action rifle, generally considered superior to the Japanese Arisaka in power and accuracy, they still faced the same fundamental limitation of needing to manually cycle the bolt after each shot. American infantrymen with M1 Garands could deliver suppressive fire that pinned German soldiers in place, enabling tactical maneuvers that would have been far more difficult with bolt-action weapons. The rifle's 8-round en-bloc clip system, while sometimes criticized for the distinctive ping sound it made when empty, provided rapid reloading capabilities. A trained soldier could eject an empty clip and insert a fresh one in under 3 seconds, maintaining nearly continuous fire during engagements. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, loaded their Arisakas with individual rounds or 5-round stripper clips, a slower process that created dangerous gaps in defensive fire. 3rd of March, 1943, in a secure conference room deep within the Army Ministry, General Tojo Hideki listened with increasing displeasure as Colonel Nambu presented his findings to a gathering of senior officers. Tojo, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister and Army Minister, had built his career on the premise that Japanese spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. The suggestion that American weapons technology had created an insurmountable advantage challenged fundamental assumptions underlying Japan's entire war strategy. The atmosphere in the room grew tense as Nambu displayed comparative firing rate calculations, range effectiveness data, and battlefield performance assessments. Major General Kimura Heitaro, responsible for infantry equipment procurement, attempted to contextualize the problem within existing constraints. "We are not unaware of semi-automatic rifle technology," Kimura explained, his voice careful and measured. Our engineers developed experimental models before the war. The Type 4 and Type 5 rifles showed promise in trials. However, these designs require precision manufacturing that demands resources we cannot spare. Each semi-automatic rifle requires approximately 3 times the machine hours to produce compared to an Arisaka, uses higher-grade steel, and needs more skilled labor for assembly. The economic arithmetic was inescapable. Japan's war economy operated under severe limitations that American planners could scarcely imagine. The home islands possessed minimal natural resources, virtually no oil, limited iron ore, scarce rubber, and insufficient food production to feed the population without imports. Everything required for modern warfare had to be extracted from conquered territories in Southeast Asia and China, then transported through sea lanes increasingly threatened by American submarines. According to analysis presented in Richard Frank's Downfall, The End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, Japan's steel production in 1943 totaled approximately 7 million tons compared to America's 89 million tons, a 12-to-1 disadvantage that constrained every aspect of military production. Lieutenant Colonel Nambu Yoshimoto, a logistics specialist, provided additional sobering details. Even if we could manufacture semi-automatic rifles in quantity, the ammunition consumption would strain our supply system beyond capacity. The M1 Garand's effective combat usage consumes 2 to 3 times more ammunition than bolt-action rifles. Our logistics network, already stretched to maintain current operations across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, could not sustain such increased demand. American production vastly exceeds ours. They can afford to expend ammunition liberally while we must conserve every round. This supply reality shaped tactical doctrine in ways that American troops exploited ruthlessly. Japanese soldiers received strict instructions to make every shot count, firing only at clearly identified targets with high probability of hits. Conservation of ammunition was drilled into troops as both practical necessity and moral imperative. Wasting bullets meant betraying comrades who depended on those supplies. American soldiers, by contrast, could employ suppressive fire tactics, spraying areas with bullets to pin down enemies even without clear targets, knowing that ammunition resupply was reliable and abundant. General Tojo listened to these explanations with visible frustration. He had staked his political reputation on Japan's ability to fight the Western powers to a stalemate, forcing negotiations that would preserve territorial gains. Every admission of technological or industrial inferiority undermined the narrative of Japanese destiny and racial superiority that justified the war effort to the population. What alternatives exist? Tojo demanded. We cannot simply accept that our soldiers enter battle with inferior weapons. What can be done to address this disparity? Colonel Sakurai Tokutaro, who had studied American manufacturing methods during a pre-war intelligence posting, offered a bleak assessment. Excellence, General. Their advantage stems from industrial capacity we cannot match during wartime. Their factories produce more of everything: ships, planes, tanks, rifles, ammunition. The M1 Garand represents merely one example of this broader superiority. Even if we could match their rifle design, we would still face disadvantages in artillery, air support, naval gunfire, logistics, and every other material category. The fundamental problem is not the rifle, it is the industrial base that produces it. This strategic reality had been apparent to some analysts even before Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, architect of the Hawaii attack, had warned that Japan could compete successfully for 6 months to a year, but that prolonged conflict would favor American industrial might. Those predictions were proving accurate. By early 1943, American production was reaching full wartime mobilization, while Japanese output had peaked and begun declining due to resource shortages and submarine interdiction of supply routes. The meeting concluded without resolution. General Tojo ordered continued development of improved weapons but acknowledged that major changes to standard infantry equipment were impractical during wartime. Japanese soldiers would continue carrying Arisaka rifles, Type 99 light machine guns, and other existing weapons regardless of their limitations compared to American equivalents. 19th of April, 1943, Private First Class Yamamoto, Ichiro crouched in a hastily dug fighting position on the northern coast of New Georgia Island in the Solomon Archipelago, gripping his Type 38 Arisaka rifle with hands that trembled despite his best efforts at control. The 20-year-old farmer's son from Niigata Prefecture had been in combat for 11 days, and in that time he had learned terrible lessons about the gap between training doctrine and battlefield reality. The distant rumble of American naval guns provided continuous reminder that the enemy possessed resources Japan could never match, resources that included the semi-automatic rifles carried by the Marine infantrymen now advancing through the jungle toward his position. Yamamoto had graduated from basic training at the top of his company, praised by instructors for his marksmanship and ability to work his rifle bolt with practiced efficiency. On the training range, he could fire aimed shots at a rate that satisfied his sergeants, cycling the bolt smoothly between rounds, maintaining proper breathing and trigger control. Those instructors had emphasized that Japanese soldiers didn't need semi-automatic rifles because superior training and fighting spirit made each shot count. The enemy, they claimed, relied on wasteful spray and pray tactics because American soldiers lacked discipline and skill. Combat had exposed these claims as dangerous fantasies. 3 days earlier, Yamamoto's squad had attempted to ambush a Marine patrol moving along a